It was supposed to be just another glittering royal evening. Yet beneath the chandeliers, tension thickened like a storm about to break. Eyes turned as Princess Catherine entered with a quiet determination that rattled even the stone walls of Windsor. In her gaze was something unmistakable: defiance. Tonight, the whispers would ignite into history, and at the center of it all, a tiara once worn by Diana, now resting on Camilla's head. The grandeur of the evening had been designed to remind the world that tradition still reigned supreme. The hall shimmered with gold and polished marble, every detail echoing centuries of unshaken hierarchy. Yet for those who understood the deeper language of the monarchy, something felt disturbingly out of place. Power here was never just spoken. It was worn, carried, and silently declared through symbols. And on Camilla's head sat the loudest declaration of them all: Diana's tiara. The jewel glistened as though mocking the woman who had once embodied grace and tragedy in equal measure. Courtiers could hardly disguise their discomfort, for everyone in that room knew what the crown represented. It was not just a piece of jewelry, it was a relic of memory, pain, and love that could never truly be buried. For Camilla to parade it so boldly was to press a finger into the nation's oldest wound, and yet she sat calmly, as though her possession of it was nothing more than the natural order of things. Into this charged air stepped Catherine, her every movement calculated yet natural, her expression both soft and unyielding. There was no dramatic gesture, no overt challenge, but her presence alone shifted the balance of the night. She was not dressed for spectacle but for statement, a quiet storm cloaked in composure, and while others turned their heads back to the stage, their eyes returned to her as though pulled by gravity. William noticed too, of course. His glance toward her was fleeting, but it carried the weight of history: his mother's memory, his wife's resolve, his family's precarious future. Catherine caught his look and offered nothing in return but the faintest nod, the kind that spoke of silent agreements forged long before this evening. Between them, words were unnecessary. They both knew the night was about to pivot in ways that could not be undone. Among the courtiers, small gasps rippled as they caught the unspoken tension. They had seen countless royal gatherings, endured endless layers of protocol, yet tonight felt different. It was as if invisible fault lines beneath the monarchy were beginning to shift, threatening to crack wide open before their very eyes. Some looked away, fearing what would come next. Others leaned forward, sensing that history rarely announced itself so loudly. And hovering over it all was Diana's shadow. Her absence was palpable, a ghost woven into the fabric of the tiara, the room, and the family itself. Every sparkle of the crown on Camilla's head carried the echo of Diana's laughter, her suffering, her rebellion against the very walls that now surrounded Catherine. The people had never let go of her, and neither had her son nor the woman now carrying her torch. Catherine did not speak, nor did she need to. The determination in her eyes was enough to remind everyone present that this was not merely an evening of royal ceremony, it was a reckoning long in the making. But what led Catherine to this moment, to this unflinching stance before the woman who dared to wear Diana's crown? Few jewels in the royal vault carry the weight of ghosts. Diana's tiara was more than diamonds. It was her story, her tears, her triumph, and her tragedy. For years, it sat locked away, only to resurface under Camilla's claim. To many, it was theft. To Catherine, it was sacrilege. And to the public, it was the beginning of a battle no one thought they'd see. The tiara's origins were steeped in more than opulence. It was never simply crafted as a crown of jewels, but as a symbol of lineage and love. Once placed delicately upon the head of a young Diana, as she stepped into a life of spectacle and sacrifice, with each appearance, it became a talisman of her journey, a silent witness to her joys and the quiet sorrows she carried behind the sparkle. When the world looked at it, they didn't see diamonds. They saw Diana, radiant and vulnerable, yet unbroken in her grace. For William, the tiara was not just an heirloom, but an unspoken connection to his mother's spirit. He had watched her wear it in moments of triumph and in moments of loneliness, and the image had been seared into his heart. Catherine, too, carried the weight of its meaning, not through inheritance but through devotion. She understood that the jewel was not hers to covet, but hers to protect. Through her, Diana's story lived on, not as memory, but as a force shaping the present. Yet fate turned cruel when the vault was unlocked, and the tiara found its way not into the hands of William's family, but into the possession of Camilla. The move was whispered about in corridors, speculated on in hushed tones by palace staff, and debated endlessly in the media. How had she managed to claim it? Some spoke of quiet signatures pushed through late at night, others of Charles's willingness to indulge her at any cost. However it happened, the result was undeniable. The tiara was hers to wear. And wear it she did. The first moment, she stepped into the public eye, crowned with Diana's tiara. The reaction was electric. Outrage surged like a tidal wave. Newspapers declared it an insult to memory, and commentators framed it as an act of arrogance. For ordinary citizens who still adored Diana as the people's princess, the sight was unbearable. They did not see Camilla. They saw the erasure of a woman whose shadow still loomed larger than any throne. To many, it felt like an unpardonable betrayal, a rewriting of history for the sake of power. Among the people, whispers grew darker. She would never forgive this, they said of Diana's spirit. She will not rest while her crown is paraded as another woman's triumph. Whether one believed in ghosts or not, the symbolism was undeniable. Every glimmer of the diamonds seemed to weep, each reflection a reminder that Diana's legacy was not only fragile, but under threat. And in the silence of her own thoughts, Catherine made a promise. She did not scream. She did not storm into chambers demanding justice. Instead, she vowed quietly that this injustice would not stand. For Catherine, this was not about a jewel. It was about protecting a legacy that belonged to William, to her children, and to the people who still mourned the woman who had once worn it. Yet Catherine's vow was no empty sentiment. It was the spark that would ignite the greatest confrontation within the royal family in decades. Camilla had always been underestimated, but behind palace doors, she was no passive consort. She had carved her place through sheer persistence, through maneuvering, and through silence that spoke louder than words. To her, Diana's tiara was not just a jewel, it was the final seal of victory. By placing it on her head, she sought to erase the past, but Catherine's resistance threatened to unravel her carefully constructed reign. For decades, Camilla had played the long game. She endured whispers, weathered scandals, and waited for the tides of public fury to ebb. Step by step, she moved from outsider to insider, from scorned companion to crowned queen. It was a rise that relied not on charm alone, but on an unyielding will to survive. She understood that in the monarchy, power was never granted. It was seized, sometimes quietly, sometimes boldly, but always with a price. Symbols were her weapons. She knew the monarchy thrived on spectacle, on the careful choreography of jewels and titles. So, when she reached for Diana's tiara, it was no careless act. It was calculated. To wear it was to rewrite history with every glittering reflection. It was to send a message that the old wounds had healed, that she had emerged not merely as Charles's companion, but as his queen, untouched by ghosts. To her, it was a statement of endurance. To others, it was a provocation. Advisors warned her against the move. They reminded her of the nation's memory, of the still raw affection for Diana. They urged restraint, suggesting other jewels, other crowns, other ways to affirm her authority. But Camilla dismissed them. She had weathered worse storms and believed she could outlast this one too. After all, had she not already defied the odds? Had she not already turned ridicule into reverence, scandal into acceptance? In her mind, this was no different. Charles, weary from years of conflict and desperate for stability, chose to turn a blind eye. He neither encouraged nor stopped her, allowing silence to become complicity. Perhaps he believed that time would dull the edge of the controversy. Perhaps he believed that his wife's confidence would shield them both. But his inaction was itself a decision, and it left the monarchy vulnerable to fractures that could not be easily mended. The media seized on the moment, crafting narratives as sharp as any dagger. Headlines painted Camilla as the woman who conquered Diana's shadow, a phrase that stung deeply for those who still mourned the people's princess. Each article, each photo, each broadcast fed into a dangerous narrative that Camilla was not only queen but victor in a battle that Diana had never chosen. It was a victory too bitter for the nation to stomach, and whispers of rebellion began to surface in the court of public opinion. Catherine remained silent, but silence did not mean surrender. Behind her calm exterior was a resolve hardening by the day. She watched Camilla with a sharp, unblinking eye, studying every gesture, every calculated move. Catherine understood something Camilla never did: that true power does not come from wearing a crown, but from embodying the spirit behind it. And the spirit of Diana still lived, not in Camilla's grasp, but in Catherine's defiance. But power gained through provocation can be power undone, and Catherine was about to make sure the undoing began. Unlike Camilla, Catherine never raised her voice. She didn't need to. Her strength came from patience, from the art of timing, and from the unshakable trust of the people. Each public smile, each poised gesture concealed the storm building within. She wasn't merely waiting for a moment, she was creating one. And when it came, it would leave the monarchy shaken to its core. To the outside world, Catherine remained the very picture of serenity. Every step she took in public carried an elegance that appeared effortless, but behind the calm exterior was a mind as sharp as steel. She understood the delicate balance of power better than most. In a family where symbols ruled, she wielded her presence like a weapon. Camilla might have carried the crown, but Catherine carried the people. And in a monarchy so deeply entwined with public opinion, that was a power far greater than jewels. Her influence within the palace grew steadily, almost imperceptibly at first, but undeniable with time. Courtiers sought her counsel. Advisors noticed how even Charles listened when she spoke, often bending where Camilla had only pushed. Foreign dignitaries praised her warmth, and the press, hungry for stories, painted her as the embodiment of stability. Piece by piece, she had woven herself into the very fabric of the monarchy, her position eclipsing Camilla's, despite the latter's official title. Catherine didn't have to declare her strength. It revealed itself through loyalty that Camilla could never command. Behind closed doors, Catherine and William spoke of the legacy that had been stolen, of the tiara that still burned in the public memory as Diana's crown. These were not casual conversations but whispered vows, shared late into the night when the weight of duty pressed hardest. William, haunted by the sight of his mother's jewels paraded as Camilla's triumph, leaned into Catherine's steady resolve. Together, they mapped out not only how to reclaim the symbol, but how to honor the story it carried. Catherine's defiance was never loud, but it was deliberate. Through subtle fashion choices, she began sending messages no one could ignore. A sapphire here, a gown reminiscent of Diana's there, each detail a reminder of who truly carried the late princess's spirit forward. To the public, these choices were interpreted as tributes, but to Camilla, they were daggers in disguise, piercing deeper each time Catherine appeared and Diana's memory came roaring back to life. In the secrecy of palace corridors, Catherine found unexpected allies. Among them was Princess Anne, a woman who had endured her own share of shadows and battles within the family. Anne's support came not in grand speeches but in quiet affirmations, in counsel delivered with conviction. She recognized Catherine's determination for what it was, not vanity, not ambition, but a mission rooted in justice. And with Anne by her side, Catherine's resolve transformed from private anger into unshakable certainty. All around them, the air grew heavy with anticipation. Those closest to the family sensed something was building, a clash that could no longer be contained. It was not a matter of if, but when. Every smile Catherine gave, every calm appearance she made, masked the storm gathering strength inside her. She wasn't waiting for fate to hand her the moment she was preparing to seize it. The world didn't have to wait long because the night of confrontation arrived sooner than anyone imagined. Windsor's great hall was buzzing that night, yet beneath the music and laughter ran an undercurrent of unease. The tiara glistened cruelly on Camilla's head, every sparkle like a dagger twisting history. Then came Catherine's entrance. It wasn't just her presence, it was her aura. For those who looked closely, her eyes carried the same fire Diana once bore. Something irreversible was about to happen, and the royal family knew it. Camilla had chosen the night with precision. The gathering was meant to showcase unity, to remind the world that the crown was steady and unshaken. Yet her decision to flaunt Diana's tiara turned what should have been a celebration into an act of provocation. Every glance toward her crown felt deliberate, as though she was daring anyone, especially Catherine, to challenge her claim. It was not subtle. It was not accidental. It was a challenge wrapped in diamonds. And then, as if summoned by the tension itself, Catherine arrived. Her timing was flawless, neither too early nor too late. She entered when every eye was already on the tiara, forcing a direct comparison between the woman wearing it and the woman who should rightfully protect it. The effect was electric. Conversations stuttered, music seemed to fade into background noise, and an invisible line was drawn across the hall. One side belonged to Camilla and her crown. The other belonged to Catherine and the memory of Diana. William stood beside his wife, but his body betrayed the storm within. His jaw was clenched, his shoulders taut, his expression caught between control and fury. He did not speak, but the message was clear. He was prepared to stand with Catherine, no matter the cost. His silence carried more power than any speech, and in that silence lay a warning. The moment Catherine and Camilla's eyes met, the atmosphere cracked like glass under pressure. Neither woman blinked, neither faltered. It was not a scene of words, but of wills. Around them, courtiers froze in place, their shallow breaths betraying the fear that history itself was being rewritten before their eyes. The tiara sparkled between them, not as a symbol of unity, but as a weapon in a war of legacy. Onlookers felt it. The air grew heavy, the kind of silence that only precedes storms. They whispered to themselves, some clutching their pearls, others staring in awe. No one moved. No one dared interrupt what was unfolding. They sensed they were not just witnesses to another royal event, but to a fracture that would leave permanent scars across the monarchy. The hall itself seemed to hold its breath. Every heartbeat pounded louder in the stillness. The stage was no longer a ballroom but an arena, and the tiara had become the prize in a battle no one thought they'd see. And at the very center stood two women, one clinging to power, the other embodying defiance. And then, like thunder after lightning, Catherine moved straight toward Camilla and the crown on her head. No one expected Catherine to act, not in public, not in front of nobles, courtiers, and cameras. Yet she did. In one chilling moment, Catherine closed the distance and fixed her gaze on Camilla. Words weren't needed. The hall froze, breaths caught, and even Charles shifted uneasily. Catherine's hand didn't tremble as she reached toward the tiara, her voice cutting like a blade. This belongs to Diana, and tonight, it comes home. The move was so sudden, so unthinkable, that the air seemed to shatter around her. Gasps echoed like thunderclaps as courtiers clutched at pearls, guests stiffened, and servants froze mid-step. They had expected Catherine's silence to remain her strategy, her power to be exercised through patience and subtle defiance. But here she was, standing inches from Camilla, reaching for the crown that had haunted them all. It was not diplomacy. It was not a ceremony. It was war in its purest form. Camilla recoiled, her hand instinctively rising to guard the jewel as though protecting her very throne. Her refusal to yield was immediate, her defiance hard and bitter. She pulled back, her eyes flashing with a warning that this crown, this symbol of dominance, would not be torn from her without a fight. For a heartbeat, it looked as though the hall would erupt into chaos, as though two queens were about to lock into a struggle that no one present dared imagine. Charles, shaken from his uneasy silence, finally moved to intervene. His voice faltered, his step hesitant, but his instinct was clear. He could not let the monarchy unravel before his very eyes. Yet before he could place a hand between them, William rose. With a single step forward, he positioned himself as Catherine's shield. His gaze locked onto his father's, unyielding, almost pleading but resolute. That moment was louder than any speech, for it told Charles what the nation already knew. This was not a conflict he could stop. Not tonight, not ever. Then, Catherine's voice rang out again, low yet searing, cutting through the stillness. "This is Diana's," she said, her words carrying the weight of grief, justice, and defiance. "It is not yours to wear. It is not yours to claim. It belongs to the people who loved her. It belongs to her son. And tonight, it comes home." Those words did not simply echo in the hall. They pierced through history, dredging up the pain of decades and binding it to this single act of courage. The moment that followed was unbearable in its tension. The world seemed to collapse into silence, every heartbeat suspended, every breath trapped. And then, Catherine's hand moved with finality. The tiara, once thought untouchable, slipped from Camilla's head. It was not just an act of defiance, it was a public undoing, a stripping away of authority in front of the monarchy's most powerful elite. Gasps turned into cries, whispers into roars. As the reality set in, a crown had been taken, not by decree, but by force of will. And yet, what Catherine did next would push this beyond a mere confrontation. For she was not finished, and her next act would transform this shocking moment into a revolution of legacy. When Catherine lifted the tiara high, it wasn't just jewelry she reclaimed, it was Diana's spirit. The crowd erupted in stunned silence before whispers spread like wildfire. To many, it felt as though Diana herself had returned through her daughter-in-law's courage. Catherine had not only honored her memory, but resurrected her power. And in that single act, she secured a bond with the people that Camilla could never hope to match. The tiara, gleaming in Catherine's grasp, ceased to be a crown of diamonds and pearls. It became a voice that had been silenced too soon, now speaking again through the woman Diana's son had chosen. Every eye was fixed on Catherine, not as a princess, not as a consort, but as a torchbearer of a legacy that still burned fiercely across the nation. The hall quivered under the weight of symbolism. For the first time in years, it felt as though Diana's presence was alive again, watching, guiding, and triumphing. Tears welled in the eyes of onlookers, not from scandal, but from something deeper. They whispered Diana's name, some with trembling lips, others with reverence, as though speaking it aloud would seal the moment into eternity. It was not just a scene, it was a resurrection of memory, a reminder that the people's princess had never truly left. Catherine, without raising her voice, had reignited the flame that time and power had tried to smother. Outside the palace, the media pounced, cameras flashing, headlines forming at the speed of lightning. Diana's tiara reclaimed, they would declare, splashing Catherine's act across front pages worldwide. News anchors spoke with astonishment. Commentators framed it as the boldest royal defiance in decades, and footage of Catherine holding the crown aloft was replayed endlessly, becoming an image etched into modern history. No carefully prepared royal statement could overshadow it. The truth was undeniable. Catherine had rewritten the narrative before the world's eyes. For Camilla, the humiliation was crushing. Stripped of the tiara in front of nobles, foreign dignitaries, and courtiers, she stood exposed, her power undermined by the very woman she had sought to overshadow. The smugness once hidden behind the crown dissolved into raw defeat. Every sparkle of the jewel now in Catherine's hand mocked her claim to authority. What was meant to symbolize her victory had instead marked her downfall. And yet, Catherine did not revel in the humiliation. Her triumph was quiet, deliberate, dignified. She did not smile, did not gloat. Instead, she held the tiara high with a stillness that carried more weight than celebration ever could. She was not simply reclaiming jewelry. She was carrying Diana back into the heart of the monarchy. In that moment, Catherine was no longer just the Duchess, no longer just the Princess of Wales. She became, in spirit, the modern-day Diana, the one the people now looked to as their true Queen of Hearts. But while the people celebrated, the palace seethed, and behind closed doors, consequences began to take shape. Behind the gilded doors, celebration turned into crisis. Advisors whispered of insubordination, of traditions shattered. Charles faced a choice to side with his wife or acknowledge the will of his son and daughter-in-law. Camilla raged, her humiliation unbearable, while William quietly stood as Catherine's shield. The monarchy itself trembled, torn between survival through Camilla's power or salvation through Catherine's courage. The crown had never faced a fracture this raw. The weight of the tiara's removal hung heavy in the chambers, long after the event had ended. Charles sat in silence, his face etched with the agony of indecision. To stand by Camilla meant protecting the woman he had fought decades to legitimize, yet to ignore Catherine's act was to risk alienating not only his heir, but the very people who sustained the monarchy. His crown no longer rested comfortably. It now pressed like iron against his brow, forcing him to confront truths he had spent years avoiding. Advisors filled the corridors with panic. They spoke of protocol shattered, of precedent destroyed, of the monarchy teetering dangerously close to a constitutional crisis. If Catherine's defiance was tolerated, it could embolden others to question the very sanctity of royal order. Yet, if she were punished, the palace risked inflaming the public, who had already begun hailing her as the rightful guardian of Diana's legacy. Every path forward threatened disaster, and Charles's inability to act decisively only deepened the fractures. Camilla's fury was volcanic. She demanded retribution, insisting that Catherine's audacity could not go unanswered. To her, it was more than humiliation. It was treason against the crown she wore, a direct assault on her authority. She railed against the silence in the room, her voice cutting through the whispers of advisors who dared not meet her eyes. But the louder she raged, the more isolated she appeared, her anger setting her apart from a family already weary of her claims to dominance. William, by contrast, stood unmovable. Where his father wavered, he held steady, his presence beside Catherine unshaken. He made it clear, through action, not rhetoric, that Catherine was not alone. His silence was not weakness, but resolved a statement that the bond between him and his wife could not be fractured by palace politics. The shadow of Diana's spirit loomed over him, and in his stillness, one could see a son determined to finish what his mother had begun. Outside the palace walls, the press transformed the spectacle into a global storm. Footage of Catherine's defiance flooded every screen. Headlines screamed of revolt within the monarchy, and commentators declared it the most defining moment since Diana herself broke through the walls of silence. Public opinion surged in Catherine's favor, drowning out the palace's attempts to contain the narrative. For the first time in years, the monarchy was not shaping the story. It was being consumed by it. In this chaos, the survival of the crown no longer depended on rituals or decrees, but on a single choice: whether to embrace Catherine's courage as the future or cling desperately to Camilla's fragile grip on power. Every moment of hesitation only deepened the crisis, as if the monarchy itself was being dragged toward a precipice. And then, when it seemed the storm might consume the crown entirely, Catherine made a final move that sealed her destiny. In the aftermath, the nation's verdict was clear. Catherine's defiance was no scandal, it was salvation. The tiara, once stolen, had been returned, not to a vault, but to Diana's rightful heir through spirit. Across the world, headlines screamed the same words: "Bravo, Princess Catherine!" For in reclaiming Diana's crown, she had reclaimed the monarchy's soul. Camilla's era was broken, and a new dawn for Catherine and for the people had begun. Crowds poured into the streets, not with protest signs, but with banners of support. They rallied outside palaces, cathedrals, and city squares, chanting Catherine's name as though she were not only a princess but the beating heart of a nation longing for redemption. Strangers embraced, as if justice had finally been delivered. They did not speak of crowns and protocols. They spoke of Diana, of Catherine, of a legacy protected at last. To them, Catherine had not simply acted, she had avenged. The global press fed the momentum, capturing the moment as a generational turning point. Diana's successor. One headline blazed, while another declared, "The People's Princess returns in Catherine." Talk shows replayed the footage on a loop, dissecting every gesture, every word. Journalists marveled at her composure. Historians compared it to moments that had changed the monarchy forever, and the public clung to the narrative that Diana's Spirit had found a voice again through Catherine's courage. No media machine could spin this in Camilla's favor. The verdict was too overwhelming, too unanimous. Camilla, humiliated, retreated from public life. Once so determined to stake her claim on Diana's legacy, she now found herself overshadowed, diminished, reduced to whispers and speculation. Her absence from key appearances spoke louder than any official announcement. She had become the queen in name only, stripped not by decree, but by the tide of public opinion and by the will of a woman she could never outshine. The power she fought so long to secure slipped from her grasp, leaving her to watch history redefine itself without her. Charles, torn between loyalty to his wife and the undeniable force of public sentiment, had no choice but to yield. His silence became a reluctant acknowledgement of Catherine's authority. Every attempt to preserve Camilla's dignity only highlighted his inability to stand against the tidal wave Catherine had unleashed. The monarch, who once commanded fear, now found himself bending to the will of the people, realizing that survival of the crown meant accepting Catherine's ascendancy. And at the center of this transformation stood William and Catherine. Together, they embodied the future, no longer heirs waiting in the wings, but leaders in their own right. Their bond, tested in silence and strengthened in defiance, shone brighter than the crown itself. To the public, they were no longer distant royals. They were the true faces of a monarchy reborn, not through ritual or law, but through courage, justice, and love. The tiara, once the subject of scandal, now became the emblem of renewal. It was no longer a mere jewel resting in a vault, but a banner raised high, a battle cry declaring that the people's voice could not be silenced, that Diana's light would never be extinguished. Catherine's defiance had reshaped the monarchy's destiny, reminding the world that symbols matter, that legacies endure, and that even in the shadow of power, truth can triumph. And so, the tiara was no longer just a jewel. It became a battle cry, a symbol, and a promise that Diana's light could never be extinguished. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.